Every time you pick up your phone, your brain changes, not metaphorically, literally. New neural pathways are formed, dopamine is released, attention shifts, memory, motivation, and even your emotional state are all impacted. The question is not whether your phone is changing your brain. The question is, how much control do you actually have left? Today, I want to take you inside the neuroscience of one of the most powerful tools ever created and one of the most dangerous distractions humanity has ever faced. This is not a talk about quitting your phone. It's about understanding what it's doing to you so you can reclaim your mind. Every time you pick up your phone, even for just a few seconds, a powerful sequence of neurochemical events is triggered inside your brain, often without you being consciously aware of it. The key player in this process is dopamine, a neurotransmitter deeply involved in motivation, reward, and learning. It's commonly misunderstood as the chemical of pleasure, but in reality, dopamine is more about anticipation and pursuit. It drives you to seek out information, novelty, and reward. And this is exactly where smartphones become so influential and so potentially damaging. Each swipe, like notification or new piece of content, delivers a small, unpredictable reward. This randomness is critical. Just like a slot machine in a casino, your phone operates on what's called a variable reward schedule. This means the reward is not consistent. You don't know when you'll see something exciting or affirming, so you keep checking. That unpredictability spikes dopamine even more than a guaranteed reward. Your brain starts associating your phone with the possibility of something valuable, social validation, news, novelty, entertainment, which reinforces the habit loop of checking it again and again. Over time, this leads to a process called dopaminergic downregulation. What this means in simple terms is that the brain, constantly flooded with artificial dopamine spikes from phone use, starts to reduce its sensitivity to dopamine. Receptors are downregulated. The baseline level of dopamine decreases. So now things that used to feel rewarding, like reading a book, spending time in nature, or having a face-to-face conversation, don't feel as engaging or exciting. Your brain craves the high-stimulation, fast feedback world of the screen, and anything slower starts to feel boring or even irritating. The danger is not just in overstimulation, but in the way this changes your baseline state. In neuroscience, we look not just at peaks of dopamine, but also how long it takes to return to baseline, and what that baseline looks like over time. Repeated, habitual use of phones to seek dopamine can lead to a lower baseline. In this state, you're not just less motivated, you're more prone to distraction, procrastination, and even depressive symptoms. There's also an important developmental dimension to consider. For young people whose brains are still developing, especially the prefrontal cortex, which governs impulse control and decision-making, this constant access to dopamine via phones can seriously interfere with the brain's natural development. It conditions the brain to seek immediate gratification rather than pursue long-term goals, which is a fundamental shift in how motivation is built. Even more concerning is how this rewiring can become self-reinforcing. Once your brain associates phone use with pleasure and everything else as comparatively dull or difficult, it becomes harder to engage in deep work, delayed gratification, or activities that require patience. You begin to reach for your phone not out of need or utility, but out of habit, compulsion, or even avoidance. This is the neurobiological basis of behavioral addiction, and for many people, smartphone use crosses that line. But perhaps the most subtle aspect is that all of this happens beneath the surface. You don't consciously notice your motivation fading, your attention fracturing, or your emotional range narrowing. It happens in small increments. You just start to feel less engaged, more restless, more anxious without your phone. That's not a character flaw. That's brain chemistry at work, being shaped day by day by the micro interactions you have with your device. Understanding this is the first step toward taking back control, because once you become aware of how your phone is manipulating your dopamine system, you can start to put systems in place to interrupt the loop. You can create space for your brain to reset, to regain its sensitivity to real-world rewards, and to restore motivation for things that truly matter. But it starts with recognizing the power you've been handing over, one swipe at a time. Imagine sitting down to focus on something important, a book, a work project, a deep conversation. Within minutes or sometimes seconds, your mind starts to wander. You feel the urge to check your phone, just for a moment. Maybe it's a quick glance at a message, a scroll through social media, or checking the news. What's happening here isn't just distraction, it's a rewiring of the brain's attention system at a fundamental level. The human brain evolved to pay attention to things that are novel, unpredictable, or potentially rewarding. This was a survival mechanism. Noticing movement in the bushes could mean spotting a predator or finding food. In today's world, our environment has changed, but the brain's fundamental wiring hasn't. And this is precisely what makes smartphones so powerful. They present a constant stream of novelty, stimulation, and micro-rewards, exactly the kind of input our attention systems are wired to prioritize. When we engage with our phones regularly, especially through apps designed to capture and hold our attention, our brain's focus becomes fragmented. Each notification, each buzz or ping, pulls our attention away from what we're doing and redirects it to something else. Over time, this constant switching between tasks begins to erode our capacity for sustained attention. This isn't just a behavioral change, it's a neural one. The brain begins to rewire itself for shorter bursts of focus, reinforcing pathways that support distraction over those that support concentration. This process, known in neuroscience as neuroplasticity, means that the brain is constantly adapting to the inputs it receives. The more we train it to seek quick hits of stimulation, the less capable it becomes of engaging in slow, effortful cognitive tasks. This shows up in our daily lives in many subtle ways. Reading becomes harder. Sitting still without reaching for the phone becomes uncomfortable. Even thinking deeply or reflecting on complex ideas starts to feel exhausting. Our tolerance for cognitive effort declines. Another consequence of this fractured attention is a reduction in what's called attentional residue. When we switch from one task to another, like checking a message in the middle of a work task, our brain doesn't instantly return to the original task with full capacity. A residue of attention remains on the interruption, meaning we operate with less cognitive clarity and focus even after we return to our work. Multiply this by dozens of small interruptions throughout the day, and the cumulative effect is a massive drop in productivity, creativity, and mental clarity. Importantly, this isn't just about the time spent on the phone, it's about how the phone changes our brain's expectation for how information should be delivered. When we're used to consuming information in short, fast-paced bursts, like 15-second videos or rapid-fire headlines, our brains start to expect all information to be delivered that way. So when we're faced with tasks that require deeper engagement, like writing, studying, problem-solving, we feel bored, frustrated, or unmotivated. The brain craves that same level of rapid stimulation, and when it doesn't get it, it disengages. The effects are especially pronounced in younger people, whose attentional systems are still developing. If a child or teenager grows up constantly stimulated by fast-moving digital content, their ability to develop focus, patience, and cognitive endurance is compromised. This has long-term consequences, not just for academic performance, but for emotional regulation and resilience. Attention is the foundation of all learning, all decision-making, and ultimately all forms of self-control. Perhaps most troubling is that we often don't notice this shift happening. Because the changes in attention are gradual, we tend to blame ourselves. We think we've become lazy, unmotivated, or incapable of focus. In truth, our environment has been subtly reshaping our brain's capacity to engage with the world in a deep and meaningful way. The phone, designed to keep us scrolling and tapping, has slowly trained our brains to seek shallow, fast, and fragmented input. But there is a way back. By understanding the mechanisms behind attention and how phone use exploits them, we can begin to reclaim our cognitive control. This means creating intentional habits, designing periods of uninterrupted work, practicing single tasking, and building the muscle of sustained attention, just like we would train a physical muscle in the gym. The brain's plasticity means it can adapt again, but only if we stop feeding it constant digital stimulation and start giving it the space to slow down, focus, and rest in the depth that real life demands. In an age where information is constantly at our fingertips, the way we use our phones is fundamentally changing how memory works in the brain. One of the most profound effects lies in the erosion of working memory, the mental capacity that allows us to hold, manipulate, and use information over short periods. This isn't the same as long-term memory, where facts and experiences are stored. Working memory is more like a mental scratch pad. essential for problem solving, reasoning, decision making, and learning. It's what enables you to remember a phone number just long enough to dial it, or keep track of the steps in a recipe as you cook. The use of smartphones, especially as external storage devices for our brains, has led to a significant shift in how we treat memory. Rather than storing information internally, we are outsourcing it to our devices. We don't need to remember phone numbers anymore. Our contact list does that. We don't need to recall facts. We can Google them in seconds. On the surface, this seems efficient, but underneath, the repeated dependence on phones to store and retrieve information is reducing the brain's engagement in the very processes that strengthen memory networks. The brain is incredibly efficient, and it adapts to whatever patterns are repeated. If we consistently rely on a device to recall even basic information, our brains begin to treat that information as non-essential. This phenomenon is referred to by some neuroscientists as cognitive offloading. Over time, this offloading weakens the brain's ability to encode and retain information because it's not being used or rehearsed. The neural circuits associated with memory, particularly in the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, become less active when we expect that we won't need to remember something ourselves. In daily life, this creates a subtle but impactful consequence. We become more forgetful, not because of aging or a lack of intelligence, but because we are not engaging the brain's memory systems often enough. The phone becomes a crutch, and like any muscle that isn't used, our memory weakens through neglect. We struggle to remember appointments, names, tasks, or even conversations. Instead of retrieving memories internally, we habitually reach for our phones to remind us, cue us, or re-show us what we've already seen. This rewires the habit loop. Don't remember, just check. Another consequence is the constant interruption that phones bring to the encoding process. For a memory to form, attention must be sustained. When we divide our attention, say checking a notification while trying to learn something, or flipping between apps while watching a lecture, we reduce the brain's ability to consolidate that information into long-term memory. Encoding becomes shallow, fragmented, and less reliable. This doesn't just impact academic learning, it affects how we remember conversations, emotional experiences, or important tasks. We might hear something, read something, even think something important, but if our attention is interrupted, that experience fails to convert into a stable memory. This also affects our sense of continuity in life. Memory isn't just about recall, it's about identity. Our memories form the basis of who we are, how we make sense of the world, and how we plan for the future. When memory is externalized, when everything is stored in fragments across apps, notes, calendars, and notifications, we start to lose the internal thread that ties events together. Life feels more disjointed, more chaotic, harder to piece together in a cohesive narrative. We live more reactively and less reflectively. Furthermore, the constant switching and multitasking that come with phone use overload the limited capacity of working memory. The brain can only hold so much information at once, usually about 4 to 7 items, and when we bombard it with constant input, we push it beyond that limit. This leads to errors, oversights, and cognitive fatigue. We find ourselves rereading sentences, forgetting why we opened an app, or skipping between tasks without completing any of them. The more we ask the brain to juggle, the more it drops the ball. But none of this is irreversible. Neuroplasticity means that memory can be trained and strengthened again, much like a muscle that has atrophied, but not disappeared. The first step is recognizing that relying on phones for every little piece of information comes at a cost. Re-engaging with memory, by intentionally recalling information, practicing active learning, focusing deeply without distraction, can begin to rebuild those cognitive pathways. Reducing dependency on external cues, and instead practicing mental retrieval, strengthens the hippocampus and the connections necessary for robust memory. The ultimate question is whether we want to be passive consumers of information, or active thinkers who shape and retain knowledge. If we want to maintain control of our minds, our learning, and our identities, we must become more intentional about how we use and don't use our phones. Because the more we rely on them to remember for us, the more we risk forgetting not just facts, but ourselves. Most people underestimate just how profoundly their phone use is affecting their sleep. It often starts with the habit of using the phone in bed, scrolling through social media, watching videos, answering messages, or reading articles late into the night. While this might seem like harmless downtime, what's happening inside the brain and body is far from restful. The interaction between screen time and sleep is one of the most direct ways in which technology interferes with human biology, particularly through its disruption of circadian rhythms and melatonin production. The human body runs on a 24-hour biological clock called the circadian rhythm. This internal system regulates many physiological processes, including alertness, hormone release, body temperature, and most crucially, when we feel sleepy and when we feel awake. One of the most important signals that tells the brain it's time to sleep is the gradual decrease in light, especially blue light, as evening approaches. The brain detects this change through a group of cells in the eye called intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. These cells are especially sensitive to blue wavelength light, and they send a signal to the brain's master clock, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, indicating that it's nighttime. When the eyes are exposed to blue light from phone screens late at night, that signal gets scrambled. The brain interprets the light as a sign that it's still daytime. This leads to the suppression of melatonin, the hormone responsible for making you feel sleepy and preparing the body for rest. Even relatively short exposures to screen light can delay melatonin release by hours. As a result, people may lie in bed feeling tired but unable to fall asleep, experiencing a phenomenon called sleep-onset insomnia. It's not just psychological restlessness, it's a chemical mismatch between the body's natural rhythms and the artificial signals it's receiving. But the impact doesn't stop at falling asleep. Even if someone manages to drift off after looking at a screen, the quality of that sleep is compromised. Research has shown that late-night screen exposure reduces time spent in deep sleep, the most restorative phase of the sleep cycle, where memory is consolidated, the immune system is strengthened, and the brain clears out toxins through the glymphatic system. This means that even if a person gets the same quantity of sleep, the quality is diminished. They wake up feeling less refreshed, more groggy, and often unaware that their phone habits were the cause. Another critical issue is that the content consumed on phones tends to be highly stimulating. Social media, news headlines, fast-paced videos, and messages can all trigger emotional reactions, anxiety, excitement, stress, or comparison. These emotional spikes activate the sympathetic nervous system, the body's fight-or-flight mechanism, which is the exact opposite of what you want before sleep. When the sympathetic system is active, heart rate increases, cortisol is released, and the body prepares for action, not rest. This keeps the brain in a state of hyperarousal, making it more difficult to wind down and enter the calm parasympathetic state needed for restful sleep. The cumulative effect of chronic phone use at night is sleep debt, a state where the body consistently gets less rest than it needs. This debt builds up silently and affects virtually every aspect of cognitive and emotional functioning. Sleep is essential for memory consolidation, learning, decision-making, and emotional regulation. A sleep-deprived brain is less capable of focusing, more prone to mood swings, and more vulnerable to stress. It's also less likely to maintain self-discipline or motivation, which means that poor sleep can create a feedback loop, making it harder to resist late-night phone use the next day, and thus compounding the problem. What makes this issue even more concerning is how normalized it has become. Many people, especially younger generations, have grown up with phones being an integral part of their nighttime routine. Checking the phone is often the last thing they do before closing their eyes, and the first thing they do upon waking. This habitual integration makes it harder to recognize the harm it's causing because it's become a deeply ingrained part of daily life. But just because it's normal doesn't mean it's healthy. In fact, the more it becomes normalized, the more widespread the negative consequences become. There's also the overlooked phenomenon of revenge bedtime procrastination, where people who feel overwhelmed or stressed during the day use their phones at night as a way to reclaim a sense of control or pleasure. It's a way to decompress, to escape, or to feel a little more in charge of their time. But ironically, this strategy backfires. The short-term relief gained from scrolling leads to long-term damage through reduced sleep, which in turn makes the next day more stressful, perpetuating the cycle. To break this cycle requires conscious intention. The brain, given the right conditions, can re-establish its natural rhythms. Melatonin production can be restored, deep sleep can return. But this demands behavioral change, setting boundaries around screen use in the evening, creating a phone-free wind-down routine, using dimmer and warmer lighting at night, and allowing the brain to transition into rest mode without digital interference. It's not just about feeling less tired the next day, it's about protecting the long-term health of the brain and body. Because when we neglect sleep, we're not just sacrificing comfort, we're undermining cognition, emotional stability, and even long-term neurological health. And too often it all begins with a device that feels harmless, glowing inches from our face, quietly pulling us further away from the deep, restorative sleep our brains desperately need. The human brain is remarkably social. It evolved in complex social environments, where face-to-face interaction, subtle cues, body language, tone of voice, and shared presence were central to communication and emotional development. These real-world interactions are not just about exchanging information, they're about forming connection, empathy, and understanding. The quality of our relationships and the depth of our emotional intelligence are largely shaped through these in-person engagements. However, as smartphone use becomes more dominant in everyday life, the depth and quality of human connection is being quietly eroded, and this has deep consequences for emotional and social health. When we communicate through screens, text messages, social media, short video snippets, we're engaging in a flattened version of human interaction. The nuances that make real-world communication rich and emotionally resonant are often missing. A text message can't carry the warmth of eye contact, the comfort of a hand on the shoulder, or the soothing cadence of someone's voice. Over time, our emotional vocabulary shrinks. We begin to rely on emojis to represent complex feelings, shorthand expressions to replace real dialogue, and curated versions of ourselves to gain validation. This has consequences not only for how we relate to others, but for how we understand and express our own emotions. The constant partial attention that smartphones encourage also fractures relationships. Think of a conversation where one person keeps checking their phone, scrolling, or responding to notifications. On the surface, they may still be engaged, but at a neurological level, their focus is divided. They're not fully present. The brain processes this as a form of disconnection. The other person senses it too. Eye contact is broken, micro-expressions are missed, subtle emotional cues go unnoticed. These may seem like small moments, but they add up. Emotional intimacy thrives on sustained, undivided attention. Without it, relationships weaken, trust erodes, and people feel unseen or unheard. This erosion is especially apparent in family dynamics and close relationships. For children especially, parental presence is critical for emotional development. Kids look to their parents, not just for words, but for mirrored emotional regulation. For example, how a parent reacts to stress or excitement teaches the child how to manage those feelings themselves. When a parent is physically present but mentally absorbed in their phone, that mirroring is disrupted. The child may feel ignored or emotionally neglected, even if the parent believes they're still there. Over time, this can lead to issues with attachment, self-esteem, and emotional resilience. Romantic relationships are equally affected. Smartphones offer constant access to distraction, entertainment, social media, messages from others that can become more immediately rewarding than the real work of maintaining a deep connected relationship. Conflict is often avoided through distraction. Vulnerability is replaced with distraction. Instead of turning toward each other in moments of boredom or stress, partners may turn toward their devices. This avoidance, while subtle, gradually diminishes emotional closeness. Partners may begin to feel more like roommates or cohabitants rather than emotionally bonded individuals. Even friendships, which rely on shared experiences and open dialogue, are shifting. Group chats may keep people in touch, but they rarely provide the depth of true companionship. The algorithms behind social media curate what we see and who we interact with, subtly pushing us into echo chambers and influencing how we present ourselves. There's a pressure to appear constantly interesting, happy, or successful, which creates a distorted version of reality. As a result, people often feel more alone, even while being digitally connected to hundreds of others. The loneliness epidemic seen across many countries today is not despite digital connectivity, it's in many ways because of it. The act of constantly comparing our lives to those we see on social media can further impact our self-worth. When we see curated highlights of others' lives, vacations, successes, perfectly captured moments, we begin to evaluate our own lives through a distorted lens. This can lead to envy, dissatisfaction, and even depression. The fear of missing out becomes chronic. The pressure to keep up, to stay relevant, to maintain an online presence, becomes emotionally draining. And all of this distracts from the depth of real, grounded, face-to-face human experience, the kind that builds lasting fulfillment. The most troubling aspect is that this disconnection often goes unnoticed. It becomes the new normal. It's common to see groups of people sitting together, each absorbed in their own screen. It's typical for couples to be in the same room, but mentally in entirely different digital worlds. Over time, our tolerance for solitude, for true presence with another person, even for silence, starts to fade. We begin to seek stimulation over connection, and novelty over depth. The brain, continually shaped by this behavior, adapts. It becomes more attuned to short, shallow interactions, and less capable of sustaining deep, emotionally rich conversations. Rebuilding connection requires effort and intentionality. It means putting down the phone when someone is talking to you. It means creating phone-free spaces, at meals, during walks before bed. It means practicing presence, eye contact, listening, not just hearing, but listening. It means prioritizing the people in front of you over the people behind the screen. Because the quality of our relationships, our ability to love, to empathize, to understand, is directly tied to the attention we give them. The truth is, emotional connection is not just a luxury, it's a biological necessity. The brain is wired for human contact, for shared presence, for belonging. When phones disrupt that connection, they don't just change how we communicate, they change who we become. And if we want to maintain emotional depth, resilience, and empathy, we must take back the spaces where true connection happens. Not by abandoning technology, but by using it with intention, and remembering that no app, no message, and no algorithm can replace the power of being truly present with another human being. When you use your phone constantly throughout the day, especially in ways that are fast-paced, compulsive, or emotionally charged, you are not just engaging with the device, you are training your brain. This training is happening at the level of neuroplasticity, which refers to the brain's ability to rewire itself based on repeated behaviors, experiences, and stimuli. The more time you spend on your phone, the more your brain adapts to that environment. But this adaptation often comes at a cost. It wires the brain for distraction, not for focus. And over time, this rewiring undermines your ability to concentrate, think deeply, and sustain attention on anything that doesn't offer instant stimulation. Phones are designed to be engaging. Every swipe, scroll, like, and notification is carefully engineered to trigger a tiny burst of dopamine, the brain's reward chemical. Dopamine is what motivates behavior. It's the signal that tells the brain, do that again. But it doesn't just respond to reward, it also responds to novelty. The unpredictability of what might appear on your feed, who might message you, or which video plays next keeps your dopamine system engaged. This endless novelty conditions your brain to seek stimulation constantly. And in doing so, it trains the neural pathways to expect reward quickly and effortlessly. This has a major impact on attention span. The more often you interrupt yourself with your phone, switching between apps, multitasking between conversations and content, checking notifications in the middle of a task, the more your brain becomes accustomed to that fragmented style of thinking. You lose the mental stamina to stay with one idea or task for long, and because the phone offers such easy access to distraction, the brain begins to find focused, sustained effort less rewarding. Activities that require patience, reading a book, writing, solving a complex problem, start to feel boring or even irritating, not because they are inherently less interesting, but because the brain has been conditioned to expect faster, more stimulating input. This is often referred to as attention residue, where fragments of attention are left behind on each task or app as you jump from one to another. Even after you stop using your phone, your mind remains scattered, tugged in multiple directions by lingering thoughts about what you just saw or might be missing. It takes time, sometimes up to 20 minutes, for the brain to fully refocus after a distraction. When this cycle repeats dozens or hundreds of times a day, you spend most of your waking hours in a state of partial attention, never fully immersed in anything. The brain's executive functions based in the prefrontal cortex are responsible for planning, decision-making, impulse control, and focused attention. These functions are strengthened through deliberate use, just like muscles. But when we offload our thinking to the phone and allow it to constantly interrupt and redirect our attention, those executive functions weaken. The result is not just a shorter attention span, but a diminished ability to regulate behavior and make thoughtful decisions. You may find it harder to stay organized, follow through on plans, or resist impulses, all because the mental circuits that support those abilities are not being exercised. There's also the issue of deep work versus shallow work. Deep work, defined as cognitively demanding, focused effort that leads to meaningful output, is what allows us to learn, create, and solve complex problems. But deep work requires uninterrupted time and the ability to tolerate temporary discomfort. When your brain is trained by phones to expect constant ease and novelty, deep work becomes harder to initiate and sustain. You may find yourself procrastinating more, jumping between tabs or tasks, or giving up when something becomes challenging. Over time, this creates a self-reinforcing loop. You avoid focus because it's difficult, and because you avoid it, your capacity for focus weakens even further. Children and adolescents are particularly vulnerable to this kind of rewiring, because their brains are still developing. When young people are raised in environments dominated by phones and digital devices, their ability to develop sustained attention, self-regulation, and critical thinking can be compromised. But adults are not immune. Even fully mature brains can be reshaped by persistent distraction, leading to cognitive fatigue, reduced creativity, and a loss of mental clarity. What's particularly insidious about this change is that it doesn't feel dramatic. You don't wake up one day and realize your attention span has vanished. It slips away gradually, masked by busyness, hidden beneath the constant noise of modern life. You may notice that you're reading fewer books, having more trouble remembering things, struggling to focus in conversations, or finding it difficult to complete a task without reaching for your phone. These are signs that your cognitive architecture is being altered, not by accident, but by design. The good news is that neuroplasticity works both ways. Just as the brain can be wired for distraction, it can also be rewired for focus. But this requires effort, consistency, and a willingness to make changes. Reducing phone use, especially during key hours of work, study, or rest, can help restore the brain's natural rhythms. Practicing single tasking, doing one thing at a time, with full attention, can begin to rebuild the circuits of sustained focus. Taking regular breaks from screens, creating phone-free zones or times, and engaging in activities that require deep attention, like reading, journaling, or meditation, can all help retrain the brain. Reclaiming your attention is not just about being more productive. It's about reclaiming your ability to think deeply, to be present, to create, to engage fully with the world around you. In an age of constant distraction, the ability to focus is a form of power. And if you want to preserve the health and integrity of your mind, you must be willing to take back control from the devices that are trying to train it. Because the brain you build is the brain you live with, and how you use your attention determines who you become. When you use your phone constantly, especially for quick rewards like social media likes, notifications, short videos, or fast messages, you are tapping directly into the brain's reward system. This system, driven by the neurotransmitter dopamine, is essential for motivation, pleasure, and reinforcement of behavior. In its natural state, the dopamine system helps guide you toward goals, sustain effort, and feel satisfaction after achieving something meaningful. But the modern smartphone, with its near-infinite stream of fast, low-effort rewards, hijacks that system. It rewires the brain to crave frequent, shallow stimulation, and over time, this rewiring reduces your ability to experience joy and motivation from slower, deeper sources of reward. Dopamine doesn't just make you feel good, it teaches your brain what to pay attention to. When you receive a notification, see a new like, or scroll through novel content, you get a small dopamine spike. These tiny bursts create a loop in which the brain learns. This behavior brings pleasure, do it again. The problem is not the dopamine itself, it's the frequency and intensity with which it's being triggered. The more you chase these small, fast rewards, the more your brain adjusts its baseline. It expects constant stimulation, and ordinary, real-world experiences, like reading a book, having a slow conversation, or completing a long-term project, start to feel dull or unrewarding by comparison. This shift in reward sensitivity is what leads to what many neuroscientists call dopamine fatigue, or reward desensitization. When your brain is constantly bombarded with small artificial dopamine hits, its sensitivity decreases. It takes more stimulation to achieve the same effect. This is similar to how tolerance develops with certain drugs or behaviors. Over time, the phone becomes not just a source of pleasure, but a compulsive habit. You check it not because you want to, but because you need to. You feel uneasy without it. You feel anxious if it's not nearby, and you find it harder and harder to feel genuinely excited by things that used to be meaningful. This has a profound effect on motivation. Motivation depends on your brain's ability to link effort to reward. When you pursue something challenging, learning a new skill, finishing a difficult task, building a relationship, your brain needs to believe that effort is worthwhile. But if your reward system has been conditioned to expect immediate gratification, then effort starts to feel frustrating, or even painful. You begin to avoid anything that doesn't provide quick results. You may find yourself procrastinating more, giving up easily, or losing interest in things that once inspired you, not because you've changed, but because your brain's reward pathways have been altered. This is why so many people feel chronically unmotivated in the modern digital world. It's not that they're lazy or broken. It's that their brains are overwhelmed by the abundance of instant rewards. When every moment is filled with stimulation, the system that's supposed to guide long-term effort becomes disoriented. The capacity for delayed gratification, the cornerstone of discipline, creativity, and achievement, erodes. You begin to prefer scrolling to studying, watching instead of doing, reacting instead of creating. The present moment becomes about consumption rather than engagement, and the future becomes harder to invest in. And it doesn't stop at motivation. Your emotional landscape is also affected. Dopamine plays a role in mood regulation, and when the system is dysregulated, emotional volatility increases. You may feel more irritable, anxious, or flat. You may experience highs and lows tied to your phone usage, feeling elated when something exciting happens online, then crashing into apathy or boredom afterward. This roller coaster creates a dependency cycle, where you seek out your phone not just for entertainment, but to regulate your emotions. But because the rewards are artificial and fleeting, the regulation doesn't last. In fact, it often makes things worse. What makes this process particularly dangerous is that it's largely invisible. Unlike other behaviors that clearly disrupt your life, phone-based dopamine addiction can masquerade as normalcy. Everyone's doing it. Everyone's scrolling. Everyone's checking their phones. And because these micro-rewards are so woven into daily life, you rarely notice the cost until it becomes undeniable. Until you realize your attention span is shot. Until you can't remember the last time you felt deeply motivated. Until your goals feel distant, your passions faded, your time consumed by things that don't truly matter. But the brain's plasticity works in both directions. Just as it can be wired for compulsive pleasure seeking, it can be rewired for balance, focus, and long-term satisfaction. This requires abstaining, at least partially, from the sources of quick reward. It requires creating distance from constant stimulation, allowing your dopamine system to reset. When you do this, your baseline sensitivity begins to return. Ordinary things start to feel rewarding again. Walking outside, working on a project, connecting with others, reading, creating. These slower, deeper forms of pleasure re-emerge, only when you remove the artificial noise that's been overwhelming your system. True motivation comes not from a flood of dopamine, but from a steady, balanced release, linked to purpose and progress. When your brain can once again link effort to meaning, you begin to feel energized by challenge, not repelled by it. You find satisfaction not just in the end result, but in the process itself. This is what real motivation feels like. And you can get it back, not by adding more stimulation, but by subtracting the constant hits that have dulled your capacity to feel it. Your phone, when used mindlessly, isn't just stealing your time, it's training your brain to seek less and avoid more. But with awareness and intention, you can reverse that pattern. You can retrain your brain to find joy in effort, depth in simplicity, and purpose in the path ahead. It starts with recognizing that not all rewards are equal, and choosing the ones that make you stronger, not just more stimulated. One of the most overlooked consequences of excessive phone use is the impact it has on sleep and, in turn, on the brain's ability to restore itself. Sleep is not just rest. It's a complex, dynamic biological process where the brain performs essential maintenance, clearing toxins, consolidating memories, regulating hormones, and resetting neural pathways. High-quality sleep supports everything from emotional regulation and cognitive function to immune health and long-term brain resilience. But in a world where phones are often the last thing we look at before bed and the first thing we reach for in the morning, our natural sleep cycles are being deeply disrupted, and this disruption can cause a cascade of negative effects on brain function and overall well-being. One of the primary reasons phones interfere with sleep is because of the light they emit. Smartphones emit blue light, which mimics the wavelength of natural daylight. This may seem harmless, but exposure to blue light in the evening confuses the brain's circadian rhythm, the internal clock that regulates when you feel awake and when you feel sleepy. Specifically, blue light suppresses the production of melatonin, the hormone responsible for making you feel drowsy at night. Even small amounts of blue light exposure can delay the onset of sleep, reduce total sleep time, and disrupt the architecture of sleep, meaning you get less restorative deep sleep even if you spend enough time in bed. But it's not just the light itself that causes issues, it's what the phone represents: stimulation, information, and emotional arousal. When you scroll through social media, check your emails, watch fast-paced videos, or engage in late-night messaging, you're activating the brain. You're giving it problems to solve, emotions to process, and stimuli to interpret, all of which keep the brain alert when it should be winding down. This mental stimulation triggers the release of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, which further interfere with the sleep process. The brain is essentially being told that it's still daytime, still time to be alert, still time to be on, and as a result, you have trouble falling asleep or staying asleep. Even the mere presence of a phone in the bedroom can disrupt sleep due to what psychologists call anticipatory anxiety. This is the subtle, often unconscious expectation that a notification might arrive, that you might need to respond to something, that there is always something happening out there in the digital world. Your brain remains slightly vigilant even while you sleep. And if you're someone who sleeps with your phone nearby, especially with notifications enabled or vibrating alerts, these interruptions can fragment your sleep without you even realizing it. You may wake up feeling tired, foggy, or irritable, not because you didn't sleep long enough, but because your sleep quality was compromised. Sleep is when the brain resets its emotional and cognitive balance. During deep sleep, neural networks are pruned and reinforced, emotional experiences are processed, and the brain literally washes away metabolic waste, including beta-amyloid plaques that have been linked to neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. If your sleep is shallow or interrupted, these processes don't happen properly. Over time, chronic sleep disruption, especially when driven by phone use, can impair memory, reduce learning capacity, increase emotional reactivity, and contribute to mood disorders like anxiety and depression. There's also an impact on the morning, which sets the tone for the entire day. If the first thing you do upon waking is reach for your phone, you are immediately flooding your brain with external input. You might see stressful headlines, emotionally charged messages, endless streams of information, and distractions before your brain has even had a chance to fully wake up. This primes the nervous system for a reactive, distracted state rather than a calm, intentional one. Your brain moves into a mode of consumption instead of reflection or preparation. Over time, this morning behavior creates a cycle. Poor sleep leads to greater phone dependence during the day to stay stimulated or distracted, which then leads to more poor sleep at night. Children and adolescents are particularly vulnerable. Their brains are still developing, and sleep is crucial for healthy growth, emotional regulation, and learning. When kids bring phones into the bedroom, their sleep quality suffers significantly. Studies show that screen time before bed correlates with later bedtimes, shorter sleep duration, and more sleep disturbances. This not only affects academic performance, but also emotional health, attention span, and social development. And because sleep deprivation compounds over time, what starts as a few nights of disrupted sleep can spiral into chronic issues that are harder to reverse. But even adults, who may believe they are managing their phone habits well, often fall into patterns of revenge bedtime procrastination. The habit of delaying sleep in order to reclaim personal time, often spent scrolling or watching videos. This behavior is driven by the psychological need to feel in control of one's time, especially after a long day of obligations. But it leads to staying up later than intended, reducing the quantity and quality of sleep, and reinforcing a cycle of fatigue, stress, and reliance on stimulation to get through the day. Reclaiming healthy sleep in a phone-saturated world requires deliberate changes. Removing phones from the bedroom, using blue light filters, establishing a consistent wind-down routine, and setting boundaries around nighttime phone use can make a profound difference. Engaging in calming, screen-free activities before bed, like reading a physical book, journaling, stretching, or meditating signals to the brain that it's time to transition into rest. And by protecting your first waking moments from digital intrusion, you give your brain space to regulate itself naturally, reinforcing a healthier rhythm of alertness and rest. Ultimately, protecting your sleep is not just about feeling rested, it's about preserving your brain's ability to function, heal, and perform. In a world that glorifies constant connectivity, choosing to disconnect, especially at night, is one of the most powerful acts of self-care. Your phone can wait. Your brain cannot. Our brains are social organs, deeply wired for connection, empathy, and face-to-face interaction. For most of human history, the way we formed relationships, built trust, communicated emotion, and developed social intelligence was through direct, in-person encounters. We learned to read facial expressions, interpret tone of voice, feel body language, and respond with authenticity and nuance. This rich, multi-sensory engagement with others helped shape not only our social skills, but also our very sense of identity and emotional stability. However, in the age of smartphones and constant digital interaction, this natural process of social development is being dramatically altered, and in many cases diminished. When we communicate through our phones, whether it's texting, commenting, liking, or even video chatting, we're engaging in a reduced form of interaction. These forms of communication are often fragmented, asynchronous, and filtered. They lack the depth and complexity of in-person encounters. You can't see the micro-expressions on someone's face in a text message. You can't feel the subtle shifts in their posture, the emotional resonance in their voice, or the shared silence that often carries more meaning than words. Over time, if digital interaction becomes the dominant or exclusive form of communication, the brain loses opportunities to practice and refine these essential social skills. The result is a decline in empathy and emotional intelligence. Empathy, the ability to understand and feel what another person is experiencing, relies on close, real-time engagement with others. It's a skill that is learned and strengthened through direct feedback. You say something, observe the other person's reaction, adjust your behavior accordingly, and learn from the exchange. But digital communication strips away much of that feedback. People become abstract, reduced to avatars or usernames. It becomes easier to misunderstand, misjudge, or even dehumanize others, because the cues that anchor empathy are missing. And when this becomes habitual, the neural circuits responsible for empathy weaken through disuse. There is also a deep impact on attention during social interactions. When phones are present, even if they're not being actively used, they subtly divide attention. Studies show that the mere presence of a phone on the table during a conversation can make people feel less connected and less engaged with each other. The conversation becomes more superficial, less emotionally satisfying. The brain, knowing that a potential source of novelty and reward is nearby, remains partially attuned to the device, rather than fully immersed in the human connection. Over time, this leads to shallower relationships and a weakened ability to be fully present with others. In social settings, this divided attention often manifests as phubbing, a blend of phone and snubbing, where someone glances at or engages with their phone while in the company of others. While this may seem harmless or even habitual, it sends a clear signal the other person is less important than whatever is on the screen. This behavior, repeated across thousands of interactions, erodes trust, diminishes relational intimacy, and creates a culture of emotional distance. And because this behavior is so common, we begin to internalize it as normal, even though it contradicts our deep neurological need for genuine focused connection. The constant availability of digital connection also fosters a false sense of social fulfillment. Scrolling through social media or chatting online can create the illusion of being socially connected, but these interactions often lack depth, vulnerability, and reciprocity. They are often curated, performative, and focused more on presentation than presence. This can lead to feelings of loneliness, even when you're surrounded by messages and updates. The paradox is that the more connected we are digitally, the more isolated we may feel emotionally. And because the brain equates quantity of interaction with quality, we may not immediately recognize this emptiness. It creeps in slowly, as a subtle sense of disconnection and dissatisfaction. This disconnection affects self-identity as well. Our understanding of who we are is shaped largely by our relationships and the way others respond to us in real life. But when our interactions are filtered through screens, and our self-image becomes entangled with likes, followers, and comments, our sense of self becomes fragmented. We begin to prioritize how we appear over how we feel, what is shareable over what is meaningful. This distortion can lead to anxiety, self-comparison, and even depression, especially among adolescents, whose identities are still forming, and who are especially vulnerable to external validation. There's a further risk when digital communication replaces not only casual social interaction, but also emotionally significant conversations. Difficult or meaningful dialogues, those that involve vulnerability, conflict, or deep emotional expression, are often avoided or diluted when mediated through a screen. It becomes easier to ghost someone than to explain your feelings. Easier to post a vague message than to have a direct talk. Easier to project an image than to reveal your truth. And yet, it is precisely these challenging real interactions that build resilience, emotional maturity, and authentic relationships. Without them, our emotional muscles weaken, and we become less equipped to handle the complexities of human connection. Even in families, the effect is visible. Meals that were once shared with conversation are now silent as each person stares into their own digital world. Parents may struggle to connect with their children, not because love is lacking, but because attention is elsewhere. Children may grow up feeling unseen and unheard, despite being physically near their caregivers. This erosion of quality time has long-term effects on attachment, communication patterns, and emotional health. The good news is that the brain retains its capacity for social connection and emotional growth. These skills are not lost, they are simply underused. By intentionally creating phone-free moments of interaction, by being fully present in conversation, by allowing space for silence and depth, we begin to reawaken the brain's natural social wiring. We relearn how to listen deeply, to read emotional cues, to respond with empathy, and in doing so we restore not only our relationships, but also a crucial part of our humanity. Technology can be a bridge, but it must not replace the road. Real connection happens not through screens, but through presence. Eye contact, shared laughter, a moment of silence. These are the building blocks of a fulfilled social life. The brain, wired for intimacy and empathy, thrives in these moments. But it needs practice, space, and intention to return to them. By putting down our phones and looking up, we rediscover what it means to truly be with one another, and we begin the slow, beautiful work of rehumanizing our relationships. The constant presence of phones in our daily lives has deeply altered the way our attention operates, creating what many experts describe as a state of chronic distraction. Our brains have evolved to pay attention selectively, focusing intensely on important stimuli while filtering out irrelevant information. This ability to focus is not just a cognitive skill, it's foundational for learning, creativity, problem-solving, and emotional regulation. However, the relentless demands of modern technology, especially smartphones, have fragmented our attention into countless brief episodes of shifting focus. This fragmentation comes at a significant cost, weakening our capacity for sustained attention and deep thinking. When you think about how you use your phone, it often involves rapid switching between apps, notifications, messages, and endless streams of new content. Each of these stimuli competes for your brain's attention. Every time your phone buzzes or lights up with a notification, it triggers a reflexive urge to check it, disrupting whatever you were doing. This interruption is more than a minor inconvenience, it fragments your cognitive flow. The brain has to constantly shift gears, moving from one task to another without enough time to settle into a deep, productive state. This process is exhausting for the neural networks involved in attention, which rely on sustained activation to perform at their best. Sustained attention is crucial for complex tasks that require critical thinking, problem-solving, or creativity. Whether you're writing, analyzing, planning, or learning a new skill, your brain needs uninterrupted time to build connections, integrate information, and generate insights. But the way phones are designed, by delivering continuous, unpredictable bursts of information, actively discourages this deep engagement. Instead, the brain becomes trained to expect constant novelty and instant gratification. As a result, we begin to favor shallow, fast, and easy interactions over prolonged, effortful concentration. This shift has profound implications for productivity and mental clarity. When attention is fragmented, it takes longer to complete tasks because the brain must repeatedly reorient itself after each distraction. Studies show that it can take up to 20 minutes to fully regain focus after an interruption. Multiply that by dozens of interruptions per day, and you can see how much cognitive energy and time are lost. Moreover, frequent interruptions increase stress levels and reduce overall cognitive capacity. You may feel busier than ever, but paradoxically less effective, less creative, and less satisfied with your work. Beyond productivity, attention fragmentation affects how we experience the world emotionally and socially. When your attention is divided, you are less able to be fully present with the people around you or the experiences you are having. This diminishes the quality of your relationships and your ability to connect deeply with others. It also weakens your capacity for mindfulness, the simple but powerful practice of being aware and engaged in the present moment. Mindfulness has been shown to enhance emotional regulation, reduce anxiety, and improve well-being. But phones, with their constant interruptions and demands, pull us away from this state of presence, making it harder to cultivate inner calm and resilience. Children and adolescents are particularly vulnerable to these effects because their attentional systems are still developing. Excessive phone use during critical periods of brain development can hinder the maturation of neural circuits involved in focus, impulse control, and executive function. This can translate into difficulties with school performance, increased impulsivity, and challenges in emotional regulation. The addictive nature of digital content designed to capture and hold attention at all costs compounds this problem by encouraging habitual overuse that crowds out other important activities like play, reading, and social interaction. Another dimension to consider is how the constant bombardment of digital stimuli rewires the brain's reward pathways. Each new notification or piece of content triggers small bursts of dopamine, which reinforces the behavior of checking the phone. Over time, the brain begins to crave these rapid hits of novelty and reward, making it harder to sustain attention on less immediately stimulating tasks. This creates a vicious cycle where the brain becomes increasingly dependent on external stimuli for engagement, while internal motivation and the ability to focus steadily decline. Reclaiming attention in this context requires intentional effort and new habits. It means creating boundaries around phone use, such as designated times or spaces where phones are turned off or put away, and cultivating practices that strengthen focus, like meditation, deep work sessions, or engaging in activities that demand sustained concentration. It also means becoming aware of the ways in which phones hijack attention and learning to resist reflexive checking. Small changes like turning off non-essential notifications, using grayscale mode to reduce visual appeal, or setting app limits can help retrain the brain to resist distraction and prioritize depth over speed. The benefits of regaining focused attention extend far beyond improved productivity. When you reclaim your attention, you reclaim your ability to engage deeply with your work, your relationships, and your own inner world. You create space for creativity to flourish, for ideas to incubate, and for meaning to emerge. You restore a sense of control over your mental life, reducing stress and increasing emotional resilience. Most importantly, you reconnect with the natural rhythms of focus and rest that support brain health and well-being. In a culture that glorifies multitasking and constant connectivity, choosing to focus deeply is a radical act of self-care and resistance. It acknowledges that the quality of our attention shapes the quality of our lives. The phone, while a powerful tool, is not designed to serve this higher purpose unless we learn to use it wisely. By consciously managing our relationship with technology, we can protect our most precious cognitive resource, our attention, and in doing so, nurture a richer, more fulfilling experience of life.